weren't going to well for me at home, and I just thought that I wanted some adventure in my life, and I thought that was a good way to do it, by going into the Navy.
Now, you were under 18, so one of your parents had to sign off. Did they have any reservations or concerns, or what were their thoughts?
Well, I wouldn't know what they were thinking at the time, but I just wanted to get away from the home, and I had never been anywhere or out of the state as far as that's concerned, and I thought that that would be a good way to see what's going on in in the country,
So you were 16 when you enlisted. Were you in school at that point, or were you working?
No, I had quit school, and that I had jobs. I was working, and one of my jobs was working at the Springfield Armory, and that's where they're making the M1 rifle at that time. And at that time, I met one of the people that I met was a person named Leo Jackson, and it just so happened that he was taking flying lessons at the time, and somehow he, through time after time, about him talking about his flying lessons, which I was not interested in at the time, finally got me interested in going up with him, just which I thought at the time, just to ride with him on the train up there to Northampton. And after we got up there, what I didn't know, that he had been talking about to the people up there that about me coming up with him to take lessons, which I hadn't even known anything about. And so they finally talked me into starting to take flying lessons. And so I managed to take, I think it was 20 hours, of flying lessons, and which didn't go so good at first, because the first time I went up and we come down to land, in which I had control, I froze at the stick, and the instructor had to take controls, because like I said, I had froze at the stick, and what he did, he advanced the throttle, and we went back up, Then the second time we come in, I did a little bit better, and but then any time I came in for landing after that, I did well,
Now, was this as a teenager that you had the flying lessons, or is that when you were a little bit older?
No, I was still around 16, 17, around that time, No, that was, no, I was about 15 then, yeah, I was about 15 at that time.
So you enlisted in September of 1944.
Yeah.
When you left for service, where did they send you?
It was Great Lakes. Yeah, that's where they
Okay.
went.
And you traveled out there by train, or how
Yeah,
did you?
by train.
And how long were you out at the Great Lakes facility?
I think about 2 or 3 weeks, and I'll never forget the first when I arrived at Great Lakes. They weren't quite ready for us to come into the base, to go through the gate into the base, and there was maybe about 100 people outside of the gate, and some had just got there, some had been there maybe 3 or 4 hours before I got there, but they're all milling around, having conversations with each other, playing games and whatnot, just anything to amuse herself, and so I'll never forget that some of the guys that had gotten there maybe a couple of hours before I did, they had obtained some paint or some kind of whitewash, and so they were acting like they had some kind of authority that had no more authority than I did that just had arrived. And so it was this like a shack out right near the gate, and so they had talked to guys, and had them come into this shack, and but what did we know? We had just got there. We thought they had the authority to do that, They were in civilian clothes just like we were, and so the guys got in there, and so I didn't go in until one of the guys, told me to go into the shack there, So when they got in the shack, the guys, they were telling the guys that had just come into the shack to drop their pants, And so when they dropped their pants, they had a brush about this big, And they told the guys, to drop their pants, and when they did, they took that brush, and just swiped their behinds with the brush, And so, they're laughing, and I'm standing in the corner furthest away from what this was happening, and I'm saying to myself, I don't want to, go in there and have them do that, And so I finally eased my way out, and they didn't realize that I had, because it just didn't look right to me, And so I eased my way out, and it wasn't long after that, then they began to call us in the gate, to be processed, into the service, So we went in there, and so they went through the program on, swearing us in and all like that. And so I was, after that situation outside of the gate, I was kind of leery of anything that was happening after that.
So you didn't even walk in the gate and they're playing practical jokes all
Yeah,
day.
yeah, but I mean, somehow it just didn't seem right to me. And so I missed that that situation there, because it didn't seem like anything that was right.
Right.
And so I lucked out on that I didn't have to go through that. And so then from that day, everything went smooth, and whatnot, and it seemed more of what was right. And you have any questions that you want to ask?
So you spent a couple weeks, this was just regular boot camp they put you through, the regular paces basically at that point?
No, I guess it was about 3 or 4 weeks, of basic training, after that. And but it was mostly drilling. That's what we did most of the time, is drilling. Then they had what I would call another thing that happened. We had parade in Chicago, Illinois, that we went to, which they had some big parade. I don't remember just what it was all about now, but we went to, our company went to parade, through the city of Chicago.
Did you get to visit any of the sites in Chicago, or just you attended the parade?
No, after that, we were loaded up, and went back to our base.
Now, were facilities segregated at the base?
Well, yeah. In fact, we were in a different situation. Like all of the whites were in that base there, and then right beside it was where all of the blacks were.
And was the training the same?
I don't know. All I know about is the training that we had in our base.
And were the officers doing the training, were they black or white?
Yeah, they were non-commissioned officers that did all of the training in our base. I don't know. I couldn't tell you any questions about what happened at the white bases, because we had no reason to go over there, or in fact, I didn't know whether we could or not, if we wanted to. I imagine we could, but they were separated, the two bases.
And do you feel the officers treated you fairly?
Well, yeah, well, everything it happened so long ago, I had to stop and think, because one thing that happened, see, they didn't allow any fighting to happen. And one of the smallest guys in our outfit. There was two incidents that happened. See, when we did anything wrong, they had what they would call the Great Lakes Shuffle. And the Great Lakes Shuffle was what happened. We would have to put steel wool under our feet and use a wax, floor wax. And what we'd do is we'd have to, it just happens when somebody had did something wrong. Well, everybody had to pay, and the outfit had to pay for it, And that was to shine the floors, with this steel wool, and wax, And because the floors would shine at all times, And they didn't allow anything to happen that the floors, like spillage or anything like that, that would mar that shine on the floors, And then also they had these, what they call Johnson bars. What they were brushes that were heavy brushes that they would swing backwards and forward, and actually shining the floor. And they would call them Johnson bars. And that's another thing that we had to do when for punishment, And then one time I got in altercation with one of the guys in the outfit. And one of the smallest guys in the outfit, he seemed to want to pick on me, for some reason. I don't know, because I was kind of quiet most of the time. And so one day we were doing that thing with the steel wool under our foot, shining the floors. And I was at one end of the barracks, and this guy the guy's sweater was on the other side of the barracks. And he had put his sweater on the shelf, and for some reason, I guess he didn't put it on there good, because his sweater had fell on the floor. And so he had some reason to blame me for it, and I was nowhere near it, So, and he came, up to me, right in my face, wolfing about, my sweater this and my sweater that, and I had nothing to do with it. And so he was okay until he went and shoved me. And when he shoved me, I hit him so fast that I didn't even realize I had hit him till I see him on the floor, And so, well, what happened after that, my punishment for fighting was I had to stand up on a bucket that turned upside down. And so that was my punishment for fighting. And everybody that passed me, I had to tell them that I'm a knucklehead, I'm a knucklehead. As they passed me, I'd have to say, I'm a knucklehead. And so Well, after that, another time that I fought was a guy named, what's his name now? Oh, his first name was Robley. No, his last name was Robley. And what he would do, like say, we're outside of the barracks, you know, and I was standing up against the barracks, you know, it was a bright sunny day, you know, and what he would do, he would walk up to me and start woofing in my face, you know, and about this or that or whatever. And he'd walk up to me and then stomp on my toe, you know. And so the first time he did it, and he'd stomp on my toe and then walk away, you know. And the first time he did it, I did nothing, you know. I just took it. And then one time, maybe about a week after that, he did it again. He stomped on my toe, and then I hit him so quick I didn't realize that I had hit him, and he, you know, it laid him out, you know. And so he never did that again after that.
I wonder why.
But then this guy that I had hit in the barracks, one morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, we usually went to chow about 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was still dark, and when I passed this tree, he was behind the tree. And when I passed the tree, he jumped out and hit me in the head with a pipe. And so after that happened, I never seen him again, you know. So he had evidently they shipped him out somewhere, and so that was the end of my fighting. And but all the time I was afraid that, because they said if they caught people fighting, that they wouldn't have their leave, you know, where they could go to town or anywhere off the base, you know. You couldn't go off the base after that. And but I never seen him again after that.
Now, did you have any special training when you were at boot camp or afterwards?
Drilling. That's the only training that I had, you know. Because if there was any other type of training, I wasn't there long enough to do it, you know. Because when I earned enough time of service time, I wanted to get out after that, and so when I earned enough time, then I got out of the service.
Yep.
Because I had I didn't like what was going on, you know, and all, and so when I got enough time, then I you know, took my chance to get out of the service.
So after boot camp, did you have an opportunity to go on leave, or did they send you right down to Pensacola at that
Yeah,
point?
well, I did, I don't remember now just how it happened, but, I remember I had, went on my first leave, and we went into what they would call a red light zone, where when by crossing that line, we run into some SPs, and they, I, both of us, the guy that I was with, me and him were arrested, and they put us in the brig, and so I remember that because the Marines were in charge of that, the brig, and we went in, when we first went in, like the first class prisoners were not allowed to smoke, you know, and I was smoking at that time, which I don't now. And I remember this guy approached me, and he was like a trustee in the brig, and he noticed that I had cigarettes, you know, in my pocket, and he, you know, advised me that I was not allowed to have cigarettes as a first-class prisoner, and he said to me, if you give the cigarettes to me, when you go to chow in the morning, he said, I'll give you 3 cigarettes, you know, in the morning, but because you're not allowed to smoke at all, you know. And so I met him at chow, and he give me 3 cigarettes, you know. And so when I went back home, back to the brig, I hid him up above the cell, and and that was the only place I see that they wouldn't be seen, you know, because there was so much dust above the cell that I had to hide. The only place I wrapped them in a napkin and put them up above the cell. And didn't you know, the next day I came from chow, I noticed that up above the cell had been dusted, and the cigarettes were gone. So that soon after that, the Marines came and got me and brought me out to the outer office. And what I had to do, they had a bucket that they turned upside down, and they told me to stand on the bucket. And when I stood on the bucket, I had to put my hands out like this, you know, or wait a minute. No, I had to hold my hands above my head.
Mm.
You know, that's what it was. And so I had to stand on the bucket for 3 hours with my hands above my head, like this. And if you can imagine, after a couple of hours of that, I mean, your hands would get heavy, and so after the 3 hours of standing with my hands above my head, they told me I could put my hands down and step off of the bucket. And when I did that, I fell to the ground, and I was, you know, kind of dizzy from standing so long, you know, like that. And so I guess after that, you could imagine that I wasn't able to smoke after that, and because they kept eye on me after that to make sure that I didn't have any more cigarettes.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that first guard set you up then?
No, the guy. Well, I didn't see him after that, you know, but I wasn't worried about smoking after that.
So then, when you finished your boot camp, where did they send you then?
To Pensacola, Florida.
Is that where you spent the rest of your time in the Navy, down in Pensacola?
Yeah.
And when you were in Pensacola, what were your duties?
I was a plane captain down there in Pensacola.
And what does that mean then?
In the morning, when the pilots, when we had to start the planes up. There's two of us together. We started the planes up and got them ready for when the pilots come to fly them.
Now, were these was this a training facility or what kind
Yeah,
of?
it was the train. They trained, you know, whatever they did when they went up. I guess dive bombing and whatnot, because that's what they were. They were the dive bombers, you know.
So were you basically like the ground crew, maintenance on these planes, or what?
Yeah, the ground crew, yeah. Our job was to check the oil on the planes when they, before they went out and when they come back in, and start them up. Because to start the planes, on the older planes there, there was a crank that we put into the planes, and we had to when the pilot got in the plane, or the guy that I worked with, they got someone after they got in the plane, then we had to. It was so hard to crank that we had to start slow, and it made a noise like and it went like that over and over until it got to the point that where it would we cranked fast enough. Then we put a cartridge in. It was like cartridge with powder in it, that after we got the crank going fast enough, then we had to fire this cartridge into the cylinder, and like by pressing a button, and it fired this cartridge to get the plane started. And after you fired this cartridge, then most of the time it would be enough to start the plane. You know? This SPD Dauntless, and then it, you know, it started the plane. You know, and then usually if the pilot was in the plane, then it after it started, then he would rev the plane up, you know, and then he revved the plane up until he thought it was time for him to start taxiing off to take off.
So you spent well over a year down in Pensacola.
Yeah.
How, you know, did the pilots treat the ground crews with respect?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. But, I mean, everyone wasn't like that, you know. Every white person that you know we was in contact with, they mostly treated us with respect, you know.
Now, did you, obviously the base was segregated.
Yeah.
Did you have segregation in the community when you went off base, or what was that like?
No, because what we usually did is we went to where the sections where the blacks were, you know.
Did you receive additional training when you were down in Pensacola?
Well, just the training of that would pertain to what we had to do, you know.
So basically your responsibilities were fairly similar throughout the year plus that you were down there then?
Yeah.
And how many men were in the crew that you were part of?
Well, maybe about 5 or 6 guys that I worked with.
And how many planes did you have responsibility for at any given time?
Just one.
Just one at a time?
There was 2 guys that were, you know, responsible for one plane. It was usually me and another person.
So there was a lot of close interaction then, but within just one specific plane until maybe that pilot, you know, went on to his next training station then.
Well, as far as I know, it was 2 people, myself and another person that was assigned to a particular plane, and I guess that was the same way with the pilot, and he was assigned to a certain plane, and he was assigned to us to take care of that plane, to start it up for him and to take care of it, you know, check the gas and the oil on the plane to make sure that the plane had enough gas to, you know, the tanks were full, you know, before he took off, and it was up to us to regas the plane when he came back in.
Did you ever actually have a chance to go up in one of the planes at all?
No,
Was it something you desired to do at the time at all?
no, because I didn't think it was up to us to do it, and so I never worried about, going up or, in the plane, because I didn't think it was something that we were supposed to do.
And did you have other responsibilities besides taking care of the planes at all?
No, not that I know anything about, no. It was just take care of that one airplane and do whatever it was that we were supposed to do, and that was it.
And when you had spare time, was there any particular things you used to do or enjoy doing?
Well, all we wanted to do is to go to town and have fun, come back to the base.
And were you with the same group of guys at the base most of the time, or
Yeah.
was there a lot of changeover?
Yeah, it was the same guys, and we had certain barracks that we were assigned to, and we never wanted to go anywhere else but back to the barracks, and when we got at the end of the day, go to town and have a good time. It's just unlucky that we went, when we did go, that we were in one of the red light districts, and so that's it.
And do you still keep in touch with anybody that you served with?
Well, for a while, I did, but most of the guys that I was in the service with at one time had died.
And while you were on duty, did you have a chance to take leave when you were down in Florida?
Well, what was that question again?
I was just asking, when you were down in Pensacola, did you have a chance to did they give you a period when you were on leave at all, or were you on constant duty when you were down there?
Well, we had, after 4:30, we're on our own. If we wanted to go to take, go to town and do whatever we wanted to do, as long as we stayed within certain areas, and but it's just one of the times that we did. We strayed into a red light area. But other than that, when we went to town, we went and we had fun doing what we wanted to do.
Now, you served until April of 1946, so you obviously were there for the end of the war. What was the reaction when you heard the war had ended?
Well, that somehow I don't remember. I don't remember anything. What happened about the end of the war. I don't remember. It's been so long.
Did activities change at the base after the war ended? They obviously weren't training as many pilots at that point.
That I don't remember anything that happened after that. I'm sorry to say.
Okay. And, so you left the service in, basically April 46. Were there any other thoughts or anything you want to share about your service down in Florida?
Oh, yeah, well, after I got out of the service, I used to go down and watch the boats go out, you know, and come in, you know, and one day that I was, you know, down watching the boats go in and come out, you know, one of the sea tugs that had come in, I, you know, asked one of the boat captains, did he need any cooks, you know, to go out, because I had had some training in cooking, you know. So I asked him, did he need anyone, you know, to cook, you know, and he said, yeah. He said, I will. I said, not. He said, not right now, but he told me the dates that they were going out again, and because they had some sea duty for you know, to go out on these tug, you know, and they had got a job to go out, and the job that he got was to go out and tow some mahogany logs from Turgo, South America, and he let me know the dates that he was going out on, and so I prepared myself to go out with him on the sea duty, and what it was they were going out from Mississippi, excuse me, I can't, I don't remember from Pensacola, Florida, to Mississippi, and from Mississippi to Turgo, South America, and to pick up mahogany logs and tow them back to Mississippi. And so I met him at the docks in at Mississippi, and so it took us from 9 days to go from Pensacola, Florida to Mississippi to because when we left, the storm, we run into a storm, and it was so bad that it took us 9 days to get to Turgo, South America. And so when we left Pensacola, Florida, we had to stop and take on 2 people in Mississippi at the Union Hall. And so one of the guys was a guy that he was not, he didn't like black people. But it just so happened that the 2 that he that got on at I'm sorry to I'm kind of nervous, all through this, but we took on 2 guys, and one of the guys was he didn't like black people at all, and it just so happened that that guy was going to work with me as my mess cook, that would peel potatoes. He would wash all the pots and pans and the dishes that on the trip. And see, what I was doing, I was cooking for 19 people. 19 people that were the sailors that took care of the like mechanics and seamen that took care of the sailors that took care of the trip for that we were going on, that took care of the barge that we towed and whatnot. And so we went over. After we got over to South America, everybody wanted to go on to town to while we were there. But so on the way over, one of the engines blew a cylinder, and so when we blew a cylinder, on the way over. Then when we blew a cylinder, then we only had one engine that was working. So when that engine blew, then they had to shut it down, and so the rest of the trip, they only had one engine to use to go over. So after we got to Torgo, South America, then they had to stop and fix the cylinder that blew. And so everybody, it was kind of a restless thing because everybody wanted to get off the boat, but he wouldn't let anybody leave the boat. And so, they fixed the cylinder that we blew on the way over. And so when after they blew I mean, fix the cylinder. They they tried to start off to go back to Mississippi, but they couldn't go because the they couldn't take off because the I'm sorry.
Need a break here?
No. I want to get this thing over with. So when they tried to take off, the anchor got stuck, and so the the anchor got stuck, and so they tried everything to take off, but whatever they tried, it wouldn't go because the anchor, the boat anchor, it just wouldn't come up. They tried to get it up out of the whatever it was stuck with. Whatever, it just wouldn't go. So what they had to do, they had to send a diver down and to cut the anchor, with a torch.
Mm-hmm.
And so after a while, and then after they cut the anchor, then we started back. And so when they after, so we started back, and so the first mate, when he didn't take a sighting when we had good weather, and so when they after we started back, then we didn't know where we were, and so when we had the good weather, they didn't take a sighting with a sextant, and then so we had to wait until the weather cleared up, and so so when the weather cleared up, then we found out that we were in the mouth of the channel, and so then the barge got hung up on some rocks, and so what they did, they backed the tug up to where the barge was stuck, and they rev the engine, you know,
Mhm.
to keep, you know, to try to blow, you know, ourselves free. And so, okay, then finally, we got ourselves free from the barge, and so we started back into the channel in Mississippi. And so then we started up, and then it clouded up again, and so it finally had to uh, call into the harbor, and to have the harbor master come out and you know, escort us into the channel. And so after a while, so several times they had to do that to get back into Mississippi, you know.
Mhm.
And so when we got back into Mississippi, my mess cook, him and the guys that these two guys from that we picked up in Mississippi on when we started out, they went to town and got drunk, and they got drunk, and so when they come back in, they said, you know, I heard all this noise, and you know, when they went to town, then, you know, I was busy with my, you know, getting the meal ready for that day, you know. And so when they went to town, they came back and they said, "Where's that nigger? Where's that nigger? We're gonna kill that nigger." And so when they said that, when I realized what had happened, I grabbed my knife and got back in the corner, you know, because when they were getting closer and closer to me, you know. And so by that time, they had some of the sailors had grabbed these guys, and the captain told them to lock them up, you know, and in one of the you know, places where they had was safe, you know. And so, and when they did that, I got back in the corner and grabbed my chopping knives, and I said, "Come on, let them come in." I said, "I'll take care of them," and you know. But see what they did, they locked them up, and so. So then, when see when we left, I had my Derringer with me, and I hid it, and so after after that happened, the first thing I did is went to find my gun. But when that day, see, that's when the first mate had done a check of the place where we were, and so when when they did a search, then they confiscated my gun, you know, because I was gonna blow them away right then. And so, uh, they did a search and they found my Derringer. And, so they, you know, confiscated. And so right now, I would like to, you know, end the,
Yep, certainly. Well, thank you very much. That must have been a very difficult experience. I could only imagine.